So you mentioned earlier how someone who's experiencing PTSD has is quicker to have that sort of fight or flight response. Let's suppose that you have perhaps inadvertently triggered someone else's fight or flight response. Then what do you do?
This is where it gets a lot more complicated. It's not as simple as like introduce yourself, ask their name and say hello. Um, a lot of it at that point is going to become about maintaining your own nonverbal communication. And de-escalation in general is a nonverbal activity. The words you use in de-escalation are almost irrelevant. The facial expression, the eye contact you're making, the tone of voice in particular, what you're doing with your hands, even the distance you're standing from the person and the angle of your body all impact this. Because in polyvagal theory, there's this concept called neuroception. Neuroception is the idea that your subconscious just kind of naturally forms an opinion as to whether you are in danger at any given point or not. So like right now, you and I probably have no sense of danger in our neuroception because, we're not in an unsafe environment. But if we were in an unsafe environment, you would start to get that kind of feeling of danger. That's your neuroception going, I'm in danger. Well, the neuroception is picking up on all these nonverbal cues. And so if you're talking to someone and you're standing a little bit too close to them and, you're just kind of glaring at them and there's a little bit of an edge to your tone, all of that is getting picked up by their subconscious, and it's creating this neuroception of danger. And it's really, really, really hard to calm the amygdala down when their whole body is screaming, you're in danger. And so a lot of it is about creating the environment where their amygdala can say, okay, you're not in danger, we can come down. And that is almost exclusively done nonverbally.
So what are some of the things that you would need to change about your facial expression or your body language in order to help de-escalate a situation?
Let's take a simple one. So like eye contact is super important. If I don't make eye contact at all and I'm talking to you, it says I don't respect you, right? But if I glare at you and I never break eye contact, and maybe I can even go a long time without blinking, it says I'm trying to intimidate you or I'm aggressive or not, right? And so the challenge here is you can't avoid eye contact and you can't make eye contact. So what do? Well, the research actually says that the average Westerner likes about, I think it's like 3.4 seconds of continuous eye contact before they need a break. And so you don't have to like sit there and count to 3.4. But what I train people is you're going to make eye contact for a few seconds while you're talking, and then just kind of casually look down at your feet. And I say feet because if you look up, you look spacey. If you look over the shoulder, it looks like you're looking for somebody more important. But this just kind of back and forth where I'm going to make eye contact for a while, convey respect, and then I'm going to look down for a little while to give you a break so it's not glaring at you. That kind of back and forth is going to create the right neuroception of respect without aggression. And so it's little things like that where like it's that plus what are your hands doing? Are you pointing in their face? Are you making fists? Because that's not going to calm somebody down. Are you talking too loud? Because talking too loud to somebody tends to create a neuroception of danger. And so it's about controlling your volume, controlling your tone, controlling your hands. It's a lot of little things that most of us are not used to paying attention to when we're talking to somebody. And so you have to learn how to pay attention to your nonverbal signals that you're sending.
I noticed that every time you used the word control right there, you were referring to, if I'm staff, the things I need to do to control myself. Whereas if I'm a staff member, I'm probably also thinking, I've got to control this situation. How is de-escalation sort of consistent with control, with the idea of having an ordered environment?
For me, we have to have a safe environment, right? I'm currently in a permanent supportive housing complex. The residents want this to be safe. I want this to be safe. Across the street, we have a shelter. The residents want to be safe. I want to be safe. So the environment has to be safe, right? And that requires a certain level of control. Certain rules have to be followed. And you can't pull a knife on somebody next to you, right? That's frowned upon. And so a certain level of safety, certain level of rules have to be maintained. For me, it's about what is the most compassionate, most respectful way that we can get those rules followed and that safety achieved. And the cool thing here is that de-escalation is basically what de-escalation says is that the safest option for everybody also happens to be the most respectful, most compassionate option. And that's why I'm just so in love with the concept of de-escalation, because it's kind of a win-win. Everybody's safer and everybody feels more respected, versus a punitive approach that says, I'm going to make everybody else safe by penalizing you, by making you feel bad, by trying to force behavior out of you. If you can control your nonverbal communication with de-escalation and conflict prevention, you can almost always get the behavior you're looking for without punitive measures. It's just a little more nuanced than simply threatening people. It's just more effective too, though.
So we've talked a little bit about preventing conflict. We've talked a little bit about de-escalating conflict, and hopefully that works, a vast majority of the time. But what if de-escalation fails and the conflict really gets to the point where a staff member doesn't feel safe?
Yeah, that's the third category, right? You always want to try to solve it in prevention. If it doesn't get past there, if it gets past there to conflict, then de-escalate. If it gets past there, now we're into safety. And that's a few layers. One is knowing when the situation's in danger, particularly when you're dealing with mental illness. And when there's mental illness, it's very, very easy for staff to say, I'm uncomfortable, therefore I'm unsafe. And they're not the same thing. Discomfort does not equal danger. And it's a challenge to help staff understand that just because you're uncomfortable does not mean you're in danger. This is what means you're in danger. And there's some research on that we can get into if you want. But so part of it is kind of identifying when you're truly in danger, knowing how to ask somebody to leave appropriately, because asking somebody to leave, which unfortunately we have to do from time to time, is probably the most dangerous situation you're ever going to be in as a staff member, because it's just highly volatile. Knowing when to call the police and how to call the police, because I've seen staff almost get themselves punched because they called in a way that was incredibly disrespectful and inappropriate and aggressive and triggering to the individual. Knowing how to back up a coworker, because if people are untrained and they see a coworker getting yelled at, their knee-jerk reaction is to go stand shoulder to shoulder with the person and join into the conflict. And now the resident feels ganged up on, which is an escalator. It makes it even worse. And so it's about training staff the proper way to provide backup. How to break up an argument or a fight between residents. There's a way to do that safely, and then there's every other way. And so it really, staff really needs to be trained at all three levels. Do this every day. It's going to prevent most conflict. If it gets past there into conflict, okay, now here's the techniques for de-escalation. If it gets past that, now here's what you need to do to keep yourself and everyone else safe.
I wouldn't want anybody out there to get the impression that the places where people experiencing homelessness are hanging out are necessarily full of conflict. What would you say to somebody who already has that impression, or who is maybe thinking that?
I mean, I would say a few things. First is I've worked in shelters or volunteered in shelters for the vast majority of my life, literally since I was 13 years old. I used to bring my children when they were, infants to the shelter. My mom volunteered at the shelter. My wife, my entire family. It's certainly, if it was a dangerous place, we wouldn't be doing that, and I wouldn't be bringing my babies there, and then someday grandbabies. But it is a unique environment that does require. I believe it requires additional training for staff in order to do it well. If you think about, just a homeless shelter of any size, they tend to be crowded. You're talking about a population that's sleep deprived, because shelters are not a great place to get sleep. And so sleep deprivation is not exactly a great, not great for conflict. You do have those high levels of various mental health challenges we talked about. Staffings, most organizations are understaffed. And the staff are under their own stressors. And so it's an environment where de-escalation and conflict does have to be taken seriously. It doesn't mean it's inherently a dangerous environment. But it is an environment where conflict and conflict mitigation needs to be part of the strategy. And if it's not, if, an organization approaches it as our job is food, shelter, and case management, stop, full stop, then they're setting themselves up for some really unnecessary challenges for their staff. Conflict absolutely can be managed. It absolutely can be mitigated. Environment can be low barrier, low threshold, and be safe. But it requires some intentionality to make that happen.
So, where can people learn more about your work?
Yeah, it's homelesstraining.com. Come by there. We've got a newsletter. We do a free trial for organizations that want to just check it out and see if it's something they want to do. And would love to work with shelters. I love the fast food restaurants and they're lovely, and the libraries, but shelters and homeless service providers, like, those are my people. And so definitely want to make sure that we serve you well.
Sounds great. All right. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.